Well, hello there, Merv. How are you doing this week?
Doing very well, Tim. How about you?
I'm doing fine, thank you. In doing research for today's topic, I was reminded of something way back in the beginning of my days of working in technology, about 91, 92. I started as a technician, a network technician, helping an old transportation company revitalize their networks. And I was looking at the leadership. These guys had been in the company for 40 years, and I had two, and they were totally different, but they seemed to resonate with me, and I wanted to follow them. One was my old supervisor, and he was 6'8", and he was grumpy, and he wasn't mean or anything, but he'd just say things like, "Oh, you're spending too much time on that risk. Just take 10% of the schedule and slap it on the back end." And then he'd force us to go out on smoke breaks. Back then, everybody smoked, right? Well, we'd go out in the back, and I didn't smoke, but I just wanted to listen to see what his attitude and what his mindset was. And he partook of his wisdom at that point, looking at us young pups. Now, that was one guy, and he was amazing because he'd walk in a room, and although he was grumpy, everybody gravitated and nobody figured it out. Now, there was another guy who was over in West Texas, and he was the manager of this supervisor, and he was more my age. And he was like a roll up your sleeves guy who said, let's figure this out together, and let's see how we can solve this problem. And he was just as charismatic as the other one. And I couldn't figure out for years why these two guys who were totally different were able to do the same thing, which was get people to follow them. And this is what led me to this whole path of exploring leadership. Have you had experience with those type of leaders in your career?
I'm sure if I thought about it for a minute, I'm sure I have had. Um, a lot of my grumpy guys were just that. They were grumpy guys. um, let me think about that as we kind of carry on.
Okay,
But I've
okay.
had,
Let me pose another question to you.
sure.
How would you define a leader? We all sort of know what they are, but can you actually put words to what you think a leader is?
Yeah, I think I can. Let me do it from my experience just to see if this makes sense. Probably a longer definition than I want to probably give. But, when I was coming up in my career in corporate IT, everyone strived to be a manager, right? That was the big deal. In fact, we're called project managers. And so I did. I worked myself up the ranks into team lead manager. And then once you're a manager, then you're striving for director and VP and all that stuff. And you keep trying to get to those points based on merit, based on your hard work, whatever it is, so that you can manage. And I don't think I ever caught on, even though I made the role of vice president at some point. I'm not sure I really caught on management versus leadership. But now to get to your question, I went on my own almost 20 years ago, about 2 decades ago, hung out my shingle and began to consult with various user organizations as well as IT organizations. And I remember very specifically my first engagement, once I hung out my single shingle, I went in and by contract, I was supposed to guide the user team. I was supposed to work with the user team, but I had no direct responsibility, no management responsibility. In fact, it was forbidden by my contract for me to manage or direct their employees. However, through sheer influence, through sheer relationship building, through sheer guidance from a kind of a non-threatening, non-directive, non-power perspective, I ended up getting more from those employees than I ever did in my corporate life as a manager. And I think the difference between leadership and management is one is very relational, the other comes positionally. The other influence or power comes positionally. And so I think I think I like the leadership one better, the influential relational one better,
Well,
because people followed me because they wanted to, not because they had to.
correct, correct. And it's funny. Actually, the project management body of knowledge defines management and leadership the same way you do. It says management is directing people in the actions and steps they need to fulfill tasks. So
Yes.
if you're a manager, you're saying, go to that corner, pick up that box, carry it over, and set it down. And all the while, you have a clipboard that said, oh, you did it in 17 seconds. Let's see if you can do it in 15
Right.
seconds. And that's management. Okay. That's good. Again, business needs management. It needs keep the business running.
Yeah.
Management says, we will keep this repeated process continuing, and so we can have predictable business. But you're right with leadership. Leadership is where we say, can I actually give people a good reason to do something that would get them to perform better than if I told them to do it? And that takes giving them something that motivates them. And so it's not just, knowing people. And it's not just strategic and vision. It's actually understanding the ability to influence without directing. Motivation and influence are really strange. And you're right. It's it's, you know, not necessarily using power and influence, but using your understanding of human behavior and how to read individuals so you can connect the work they're doing
Yeah.
with fulfillment of personal needs. And that's the secret.
Well,
Go ahead. You're going to say something.
I was going to say, and I'll tell you, I have worked for managers who are not good leaders. I have worked for excellent leaders who are not particularly good at day-to-day management. And it's, when you get that rare breed that has both, those are the people who really move progress forward. Those managers, for example, that did not have particularly great leadership styles. But I'll tell you what, when we were deep in the trenches and had to hit that next deadline, I want a manager who is stuck on process and structure and is reading his Gantt charts daily, rather than the leadership that's the leader who's going to come back, slap me in the back, says, you're doing a great job, but not really aware of what's going on. So there's pros and cons to both. And like I said, if you get the person who's got both qualities, both skill levels, what an incredible combination.
And that's what we want as project managers, to be good managers when it's needed, to be good leaders when it's needed, and know when each one is needed. And that is a real trick.
Yeah.
Where can you actually understand? And you mentioned it, when a manager needs to switch. What are the criteria that would tell you I need to manage now and I need to lead now?
Well, and I think for one example I use, when you're knee deep in the trenches and have to hit that next deadline, I don't know about you, but the contracts that I've worked on over my lifetime had penalties if you don't make the deadlines. And if you do make the deadlines without the requisite quality, there were penalties. So you wanted that manager who kept his eye on the ball and kept the team moving towards that ball the whole time. And that person who understood the process, who understood his people or her people, and was able to work with them to get across the line. That is the kind of manager I want there. On the other hand, when I've got a team that is perhaps as a result of too many late nights and too much overtime, sort of getting down in the dumps and down on themselves, and not as, probably demoralized, perhaps is a way of saying it, or not particularly effective or self-motivating, then I would like to switch to that leadership style so that I can work with people on an individual and on a team basis. And even though I'm not the one who can motivate them, motivation comes from within, I can at least be the one who clears the hurdles and puts a new kind of step in their gate to help them get out of the doldrums and get back onto the process. So a leader in that case has to be an encourager, Whereas a manager, perhaps without that quality, would be less effective in a situation like that. So I think there's different times that you want to operate with the different skills. And those are two examples that came to mind very quickly for me.
So you're talking about being a situational leader or a situational manager. The situation and the environment itself requires the certain behavior.
Yeah, I think to a, yeah, I think to a certain extent, but I think if you always have both qualities, you know which situation that you bring one up higher than the other. I think that's maybe what I was trying to say, more
Okay.
than just grab one situation and say, okay, I'm going to be a leader now. And here I'm going to be a manager now. I think there's times when you exalt one and put down the other one in the situation.
Yeah, it can't. You're saying it can't be scheduled, right?
Yes, you're right. It cannot.
Yeah. Okay, very good. Here's another question that some of my students give me. Why should I even learn this management and leadership? What good is leadership if the project's going south? And what what what's bad management to do? It's the workers that do the job, and the workers are going to pull through. So why would I even worry about being a good manager or a bad manager? And let's just talk about managers, and then we'll talk about leaders.
Oh, that's a great question. I think, someone once told, and this is probably a quote that's out there, but someone once passed this quote on to me. They said, people don't leave bad jobs or bad companies. People leave bad managers. So I think the situation that you put yourself, or that question that your students have asked you, I think the idea of striving to be a good manager is one that can help direct his team in a motivating style, as opposed to being the one who demoralizes and demotivates. It's interesting. We say that we cannot motivate the other person. Motivation has to come from within. But I've noticed that it's pretty easy to demotivate the other person. And I think a bad manager does, in fact, create that kind of demotivation such that you lead to chaos, disorganization. The worst kind are the ones who do and then redo, right? Doing and then nothing worse than redoing something that you've already done. Things with quality issues, things with missed deadlines. That's the kind of manager you don't want to be. And first of all, if you're that kind of manager, you won't have that job very long anyway. So
Right. There's an old quality theory that goes on with that. You're reminding me of, and let me get the name of it before I start misquoting. Just a second here. Let's see here. Who was it? Hertzberg, hygiene factors and motivating agents. And he said, hygiene factors will not motivate, but lack thereof will demotivate. And what you said was almost exactly to those words.
interesting.
Basically, you have to have some things in place or people won't come in, clock in, and even do the work. And he further said that you can't have motivation without having some simple things in place. You got to make sure that people are safe. You got to make sure that people have a regular paycheck and they have some predictability in their environment. And this is necessary to be a good manager. And again, this is Hertzberg. It's a theory, but I would submit to everybody to. I wouldn't ask anybody to experiment on this theory and try out being a bad manager, but see how it plays out in your work environment with different management styles around you.
So I'm curious, Tim, how were you able to answer your students when they asked you that question? Because, we come from slightly different aspects of our career. How were you able to
Yeah.
answer?
So good and bad management is just what you said at the beginning of the show. It's if you don't measure, you can't understand. If you can't understand, you can't decide what to do. And if you can't decide what to do, you're out of control. And that's exactly what a bad manager is. They have absolutely no control. They're sitting in the back of the bus and it's going off a cliff. From a leadership standpoint, lack of emotional intelligence and the lack of self-awareness means that you're going to be pushing personal triggers. You're going to be saying things that are contradictory to what other people perceive. And without understanding this and preparing them for simple paradigm shifts, how are you going to help them over major changes in the way things look? Now, why is that even important? Because when you get to projects, it's a change. And when we change, we don't just change a piece of equipment or change a process. We change everything around people, even their behavior. And without people being aware of this and without helping people prepare for that change, they're going to be stuck and they're not going to budge. If we all know culture eats process for business, and without being a good leader and helping people easily overcome these obstacles just in their own perception even, you're not going to get anywhere. That's the best I could come up with, and it seems to resonate even with people who've only been project managers for 2 or 3 years.
Yeah, and I think it does. And like going back to what I started off earlier is, in our career, we strive to be managers, right? I think mainly, well, I think 2 reasons. I think we kind of like the power a little bit because now we've got people that we're kind of responsible for. But secondly, typically it comes with a slightly higher paycheck. And so we strive to be those managers, whereas a leader is can be kind of an undescribed or indefinite. There's no position in a company called leader. As far as maybe some companies have that, but in my experience coming up corporate. And so I had actually posed this a couple of weeks ago on my LinkedIn profile. I put out a question to people who I follow and who follow me. And I said, what's your experience, leader versus manager? And I pulled up one while you were speaking there. And I said, one of the guys said, and I like this one. He said, depending on the type of project, there are times during a project when strong leadership skills like creativity are required. There are other times when solid management is required, sort of what I talked about slightly earlier. A project manager should be able to handle both situations. And he goes on, he says, I believe leadership is very important when managing the project. As a leader, I'm creating and sharing a single vision to the team. I am willing and able to help because the team's success is the success of my vision. The leader lives and breathes team spirit. Team members will not hesitate to reach out to a leader. I believe managers try to enforce someone else's vision. And if that vision is not properly understood, or if there's a misalignment, it's disaster for the whole team. So I thought he kind of nailed it. And I kind of responded a little tongue in cheek, but in having gone through several of these responses, I said, it almost seems that the manager is the boring guy or gal that dots the I's and crosses the T's and makes it happen, while the leader is the cheerleader guy or gal who keeps up team morale and keeps the vision in the team's view at all times. Put those 2, yes, stereotypes together, and you have a dynamite combination. And I think the essence kind of, that kind of pulls apart and puts together those 2 meanings, I think.
Yes, exactly right. I go back to the project management body of knowledge. The whole role of the project manager section in the 6th edition talks about this in detail. You have tactical managers and strategic leaders. You have keep the business running managers and keep the vision inspiring leaders. Yeah. You have the managers who make sure that the data is collected and analyzed and you're making the best decisions. But the leaders are saying, is this the decision we need to get to where we want to go? And you're exactly right. They fit hand in hand. I wouldn't say hand in glove because one is not driving the other, but I really believe that they are both skills that we need. And again, it's easy to learn how to manage. There's two theories to it. Number one, it's easier to collect data and determine the outcome from a data than to learn relationship skills.
Mhm.
Number two, it's easier to learn skills than it is to learn behavior and character. The domain of the manager is the acquisition of skills, where the domain of the leader is the acquisition of behavior and character. And I've thought about that for years and years, and I'm just now cracking the surface of what that really means. And like I said, one does not mean the other is wrong. If you know their application, like you said, it's a dynamite combination.
Don't you find that and I know, I'm not just in IT, but kind of in business in general, that we kind of look at that manager as kind of the mundane person that keep the business running, and the leader is the person we all want to emulate and follow and slap on the back and go for drinks with. And I mean, why do we give that? I think that's an incorrect perception, by the way. But we seem to, in IT and in business, give those perceptions of those two very distinct roles.
I don't know. It has to do with something with our understanding that there is something besides being an expert. Simon Sinek talks about this. You know, a leader doesn't jump into the fight with a sword. His statement is in alignment with what you and I agree with leadership. It's the person who jumps in with a shield. And if somebody has your back, and if somebody is protecting you and making it very easy for doing work that is self-rewarding, you're going to want to be around them for a while. It's human behavior. It's that. And then if you add to that a little self-knowledge and a little bit of human behavior knowledge, where you understand the mechanics and the application of charisma and charm, you can actually see where this could take someone who's just a janitor, but still is able to sit down with a cup of coffee with the CEO every Tuesday and talk about the news.
That's true. Here's something. We're talking about manager. We'll get to leader here, I think, shortly. But I came across a quote, and I really, really like this quote. I can't pronounce the gentleman's name very well, but it's Aga Hassan Abedi. Aga Hassan Abedi, I think, is the name, how it's spelled. But his quote was, "The conventional definition of management is getting work done through people." And I think we would probably agree with that as a convention.
Mm-hmm.
But real management is developing people through work.
Yes, 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 yes.
And I'm wondering how much of that is also leadership encased in that management definition.
One of my mentors at my last corporation was really inspirational. And he said, "Tim, who are you growing? Who are you mentoring?" And I said, "I don't have anybody. I'm just a little manager. I'm learning the ropes myself." And he said, "Tim, no, 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 no." He said, "You need to have somebody who's going to replace you. Do a succession plan right now and find the person who is best fit to do the job you're doing." And of course, me being, not so smart Tim, said, "Isn't that going to get rid of my job?" He said, "That's the secret." They don't replace you. They push you up.
Yeah.
They push you up. And I didn't understand that until I started applying it. A lot of these things seem 180 degrees from what we consider. But you're right. These people who we lead don't get ahead of us. They always stay behind us, and they force us to be ahead of them constantly.
Well, it's similar in consulting. When I was in consulting, I remember getting a fairly good sized extension from one of my clients one time. And my buddies all slapped me in the back and, yay, you got an extension, way to go. And I said, no, that's not way to go. My job as a consultant is to work myself out of a job, similar to the manager who's there to work himself or herself out of a job, because you want to bring that person up behind you to take your position, to release you to do other things.
Right.
So you're right. It's 180 degrees difference from what kind of common sense thinks about. You know, you started off with an example of those two gentlemen that you worked for. Were those your best managers or best leader? Actually, let me ask you the question differently. Who, in your experience, do you think, or can you give an example of one of your best managers and what you learned?
You know, it was probably back then, back when I was working in the transportation industry, because these guys were brilliant. I was working hand in hand with industrial engineering, and this manager, he he knew his data and he knew his process backward and forward, and he always asked questions, and he wasn't intending to validate. He was intending to see if I saw something different than he did. He was looking for small deltas, not big perceptual differences, because he knew I was just a young pup and I was only going to be there for 7 to 12 years and he'd been there for 35. But he wanted to use my eyes and ears to collect information, to gather his better vision so he could actually understand exactly what was going on. The domain of a manager, he taught me, was progress and status. And I didn't understand it till later. He said the domain of a leader is the forecast.
Good point. Good point.
He was absolutely brilliant. It wasn't he had his finger into every pot, but he had an information channel like nobody I have ever seen since.
I think that's interesting. I think I was trying to relay back in my own mind as to who might be one of my better or best managers. And I think I was trying to think, I was a co-op student in college and I got a co-op program. They actually brought me back for another summer and then they hired me full time afterwards. And I had the same manager in the co-op as I did when I came on board. Her name was Shelley. And I think Shelley probably helped me understand what it meant to leave the farm and all of that responsibility, but leave college and enter corporate life. And I think her patience, her wisdom, her ability to tell me when I was off track and when I needed to turn things around. I think the ability for her to have that assurance that she could correct me and also encourage me was probably one of the best examples I have of a great manager for someone who was just starting out in their career and probably set me on the right track.
You know, that reminds me of an old framework for leadership. It's called Situational Leadership, and they used to teach it back in the 2000s. It's the ability to look at somebody you're responsible for and pick up simple data points, and by that know what they need. For instance, use confidence and use experience, and just go in with those two data points. And how do I handle this situation? When people have low confidence and low experience, you're going to have a lot of demonstration, and you're going to have them demonstrate to you after they've seen an expert do it more than once.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to manage. Now, when you have somebody with low experience and high confidence, this is where things get wacky.
Yes.
And again, you can see where this is leading you. This is a management framework. It's collecting simple data to actually create an astute analysis of what's going on right now in the work environment. And you can do it so quickly. And then you know exactly what the situation means. And it doesn't have to worry, about building a relationship. So it's a true management skill. It's not necessarily a leadership skill. It's brilliant. And these things are all around each corporation. I found out after I started hopping from corporation to corporation as a consultant, has their own little tricks and traps, like I was demonstrating. And it's fascinating
Yeah.
how management is easily quantified and uses something to get exact results from the data gathered.
I, I tell you, next time you're on with your students, I'm going back to their question to you. I, I'd love to address them because this may blow their socks off. I come from largely a matrixed management situation.
Uh-huh.
And I remember at one time for one of the major consulting firms that I worked with, at one time I counted 6 managers to whom I was responsible. And all 6
Wow.
had equal rights to pull me in their direction.
Wow.
And so there was my industry lead, there was my technology lead, there was my office regional director, there was my career manager, and there's a couple others that I was responsible to. And literally, I could be working on a project in Oklahoma City and have one of the other managers say, "We need you to work on a proposal in Pittsburgh." And so you're having to deal with client situations and corporate situations and management situations. And there, I think, talk about a combination between a management understanding of your predicament as a person who's having to do the work for the corporation, combine that with the person who is in that predicament having to juggle these balls and assuage all 6 managers. Probably not at one time,
You,
but it became a real challenge. Yes.
you know what's funny? You have had a matrixed model, right?
Yes.
We called that flat. And we had self emerging teams or self-organizing teams even back then.
Mhm.
And this is what we dealt with all the time. And it's funny how we had to not just lead the people who were in our projects, we had to lead and inspire and motivate all up and down the rank, the hierarchy inside of our organization. And that's when, and you actually or reminded me of this. This is when I started learning that you don't just lead your peers and the people who are following you. You have to lead your executives and your leaders too.
Yes. Yeah. Especially if they're not talking to each other.
Did you ever have an issue where you had to effectively lead a sponsor? And if you did, how did you manage to lead a sponsor to the right outcome or to the most successful outcome?
That's a great question because, yes, I have had that situation, and it happened more directly when I became an independent consultant, hired by organizations to help them. And I'll tell you, whether I was working for the IT provider or whether I was working for the organization who was being serviced by the provider, in both situations, I ended up face to face with the sponsor. And I think a lot of what worked for me in terms of leading them was the fact that, first of all, in all humility, seriously, with all humility, I would allow them to understand my credibility. I would listen half as much as I would talk half as much as I would listen. And I would correct misunderstandings from their perspectives by using examples rather than say, "No, you're wrong," or "No, let me give you the right thing." I would use an example that let them come to their own conclusion that perhaps they should think about things differently. But what ended up happening was, because of my experience and credibility in the situation that we were in, they allowed themselves to kind of fall under my tutelage and then ended up being led in a situation. They still made the decisions. They still got out in front of their staff or their constituents and and kind of directed the effort from that point. But I knew very much, having sat in those audiences, that they were definitely working from our conversations. So I think it just came down to just letting them be them and just showing them the benefit of my experience and credibility in those situations. Does that make
That's,
sense?
oh, totally, totally. It's the art of persuasion. How do I get somebody not to change who they are and not to change their behavior, but open their minds just enough to see the world the way I see it? And that class of communication is called persuasion. It's not manipulation. Manipulation uses the same skills,
Yeah.
but manipulation forces a perception that that person may or may not want, and it leads them down a path that they don't desire. Persuasion is allowing them to have the option to follow you, and yet they still follow you. And this is where it gets really interesting. In consulting, you have to be very good at persuading. And it takes the intellect, it will take a strong sense of wrong or right, and it takes your understanding of emotions, all three of them together. One of the things that I learned is that if you don't have a strong moral compass, if you don't have this sense of a unified vision of what's wrong or right, people get confused around you.
Oh yeah.
If you're
Absolutely.
authentic, and if you are, if you have quote unquote integrity, it seems to be a lot easier for people to buy into what you're saying.
Well, exactly. And then let me add one more thing to my previous response. I didn't mean to sound like it was all one way, like I was
Oh
the
yeah.
qualified only expert and they turned, that's not how it happened. Because a lot of times in the discussion, they would come back and say, yeah, but in our organization, you have to understand, we've got a union over here. Oh, I didn't realize that. Or we've got something over here. Oh, I didn't understand that. Well, let's talk through that. And so it was a give and take and come to a conclusion that made sense. So there's many times that I would back away from my very strong belief in how this might work because of them understanding their own organization. So yeah, I think it's very much, well, it gets back to relational, right? Relationship. And I think that gets back to the leadership aspects of what it is that we do as project managers, as project consultants, as project leaders, however you want to present
It
that.
and it's funny. It almost sounds like they are different classes of tools that we use, based on the needs at hand, and it's all for one thing. Is it necessary? Does it make things better, and does it minimize failure? One of the things that I teach my students is that I'm not the smart one in the room. I'm about 5 to 10 years ahead of them. I've tried and experimented with the tools, and this is what I found. And I lower their guards down quickly so that they can actually have opinions and comments. People are afraid of being wrong.
Yeah,
And if this is where leadership gets really valuable in a project. You cannot afford people to withhold information. So if you have people who are comfortable, you create that environment of safety, who are able to, tell you what's really happening. And they're not punished for it, but they're supported, and all of a sudden they realize that it doesn't make things worse, it makes things better. It actually doesn't just make things better in the short term. In a repeated environment, all of a sudden they have a predictable outcome that means that somebody's going to have my back for the long term. And that's where
exactly.
the mentorship comes in.
Yeah. Oh, we talked about mentorship a couple of weeks ago, but we did. I remember also talking about it in the context of leadership and that sort of thing. So
And you can't talk about one without the other, can you?
yeah. We've spent no, you can't. we've spent a fair amount of time kind of discussing management. Should we switch over maybe a little bit in terms of leadership and say what's the effects of good leadership or good or bad leadership, or have we covered that?
Actually, we touched on it a little bit, but let's formally address this question, because I think you and I, now that we've fleshed out this material, I think you and I have a common vision of what it is. But go ahead and lay out what you think is the effect of good and bad leadership.
So even as you were talking, the last kind of partial segment that you're talking about in terms of the trust and knowing that you'll be heard, I think leadership has to, as you were saying, you have to create that atmosphere so that, you've heard when people put up their hand and go, this may be a stupid question. No, there are no stupid questions. Well, if you create the atmosphere such that people will put up their hand and say, and just ask their question without saying, this may be a stupid question. I mean, you've already won the day, because people feel that even if it is a stupid question in the eyes of whoever, it doesn't matter. It's going to be addressed. So I think there's that trust. There's that knowing that you'll be heard. I think there's also a good leader also creates that atmosphere that allows people to self-motivate. I think a good leader creates that atmosphere, that synergy among staff, where you can get people who previously were bickering are now fast friends. I mean, there's a whole lot of, and you stuck on it before. There's the human behavior, human dynamic aspect to that, where you're really watching out for relationships. You're not putting away process. You're not putting aside technology. You're not putting aside the need to hit that next milestone. But in doing that, you are really spending a lot of time working as a leader on that relational aspect of your leadership.
I really have a lot of hope for Agile right now. I've watched it through the hype cycle, where everybody said Agile was going to solve the world, and then everybody disliked Agile because it was hard to implement. In an organization that is not ready for change, Agile is going to fail. Because it requires so much communication and so much involvement of the stakeholders in the work. Now, you're right. It's a struggle to create that environment, but when you do get it, interesting things happen, and that's what we discovered in my consulting group. If you give people a little bit of your power, if you delegate and allow them to demonstrate that they have the ability to get things done just like you do, it creates, number one, a sense of self-respect and pride in their work. And number two, it frees you up to do the more strategic work. And my mentor actually used this as an opportunity to engage with the clients for future work, as well as to become more of a strategic fellow traveler instead of just another contractor in the belt of the corporation.
Yeah.
This is the beautiful thing. Like I said, leaders, good leadership means that the leaders can actually attend to the strategic activities. And again, with Agile moving in, there's that opportunity that we can to move in and think and behave more from an executive standpoint instead of just a tactical and activity standpoint.
I've never actually worked an Agile project. I've only ever worked those long, what do we call them? Waterfall, those kind of methodologies.
Predictive, yeah.
Predictive, yeah. But I tell you what you were just talking about, where Agile is struggling. One of the things that I did, and my leadership mentors and peers did along with us, was we made sure that communication was always there, both in the team and the client. And so whether you're doing Agile, where communication is the lifeblood of Agile, communication is the lifeblood of predictive as well.
And as we observe, I'm not going to talk too much about this, but there's another edition of the PMBOK coming out. As we go further and further and understand how predictive and agile are just methodologies within project management itself, this requirement for deep communication and this requirement for analysis of data is just as needed, and it's like clarity of roles and responsibilities. It's the same thing, but agile is a fresh look at this, and I'm really interested in seeing, if there is a renewed adoption of this just for those purposes, because it doesn't have to be that way.
Right.
What we're talking about, leadership is leadership. Let's start talking about servant leadership, because this gets really interesting. The new exam is highlighting this term, and in Scrum, which is a framework for Agile, they've been using the model of servant leadership, and it seems to be a buzzword that's been around for a long time. When did you start hearing about servant leadership, and what it was, and what was your response to that?
I think I first probably heard about it in the literature when it became, to use the vernacular, a thing, when it became a thing. But and somehow I've always, I don't know, when I came to that point where I saw what in my management style was not working, and then what I saw what was working, it began to kind of form within me that natural progression of an understanding where I really wanted to, in order for me to succeed, I had to have my team succeed. I could not do their job, but I could clear the hurdles. I could keep the information flowing. I could keep the tasks assigned. I could keep them, kind of revved up and keep going. And so from that perspective, as long as I served them, I mean, there was times I went and got coffee for my staff, sat down with them and had that conversation. Now, I had bosses who would never bring a cup of coffee to a lower person. That was kind of that kind of mentality or that style. From my perspective, as long as I could serve them first and make sure that their highest priority needs were being accommodated, then I found out that as long as I stayed back out of the limelight and pushed them forward to get their jobs done, it really worked for me. I mean, it really worked. I shouldn't say for me, I should say for the project, for the staff. And I found out we got along better that way as well, because I wasn't dictating and, banging my finger on a desk saying, why isn't this done? I was bringing them a coffee and saying, how can I help you get it done? If you understand it. So I don't know. I did read about it, but I think naturally I began to recover from some bad mistakes I made in my early management career.
Mhm. I was fascinated because I was a student of business from early 1990s, and I started putting two and two together. I started out at the university in fine arts because I had a great voice, and I was really a quick learner in music, but I knew that it was going to be a dead end career-wise. And so I broadened my horizons with behavioral science, and I looked at philosophy, and I looked at the social sciences and everything. And I was interested in these stories and myths that all of humanity painted, right? And they always painted the best leaders as somebody who was willing to sacrifice themselves, right? Epictetus says, we first learn how to do good when we want people to see us doing good. And we then learn to do good because we want to do good. And then we learn to do good even when it's painful. And we have in the movies, right? In our movies today, in the fairy tales that have been told in all of our cultures, it's the person who holds the door open for everybody else and goes through who's the real hero of the movie. They're the one that we aspire to. We could never see ourselves as sacrificing someone of ourselves. And so for some strange reason, I put this vision of this fairy tale person who wasn't really a leader, but was somebody we aspired to because of their behavior and character. And all of a sudden, when I started seeing this in the business literature, in the business textbooks, it just clicked for me. They're talking about a servant leader, somebody who cleans the rocks and weeds out of the fields so that the good, lush plants and animals can grow. And it all made sense.
Well, and I remember one time I was in a training, a management training. Oddly enough, they called it management training. But the person, and I hadn't seen this before, but the person, he drew the pyramid, right? The pyramid on the whiteboard. And you're looking and all of us on the ball, all of us worker bees were along the bottom, and the pyramid kind of went up to the single point of contact. And think of an organization where you have a CEO or a president or someone like that. So everything kind of focuses up. And then he took that pyramid and he turned it upside down. So the point was on the bottom and the flat part was all the way across the board. And he said, this is how we need to manage our projects. As the president or the CEO on the bottom, what's your job? It's to make your vice president successful. What's their job? It's to make their manager successful. What's their job? It's to make their project successful. What's their job? It's to make their staff successful. So if you look at it from that perspective, that clicked to me as well. And I don't think they use the term servant leadership, but that's kind of my visual of how a servant leadership organization or process could work.
And it's not emotional. It's not something that is, a relational thing. It's a bottom line revenue.
Yeah.
If you are not taking care of your people, they're the ones making money for the company. And if you make decisions that impact the people who are generating the revenue, what direction can the company make?
Right.
And so it was obvious why servant leadership was looking at a preferred one. Do you think it is, quote unquote, the preferred method? I know we talked a little bit about this earlier, but what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's certainly my preferred method. It's the one that which has allowed me to be more successful, and not just as a manager in corporate, but also in my single shingle consulting. When I got my first consulting process to the point that I retired, I did not have unbillable days. I literally went from a project in one state to a project in another state because I was always marketing, and I always had people who were willing to refer me to the next project. And a lot of that came from, I think, that style of leadership, which we now call servant leadership, but it's to put the other person first, put myself in the background, but through that be influential and relational rather than directive. And I think my test, and it was often brought out by people who would call me later or send me emails. My test was, do those that I served, especially those on the front lines, did they grow as people? Did they grow in their careers as a result of me helping them? And if the answer was yes, then it worked for me. And so your question was, do you think it's going to be sort of more ubiquitous? I don't know. I think there's still too many people out there with egos, and there's still too many people out there in the project world who are focused on process and schedules more than their own staff. And as long as that's happening, the servant leadership model does not have a chance to grow in that kind of environment.
And we still have external or environmental factors that we have to work and live within.
Yes.
A lot of businesses have cultures and environments that are not really in alignment with service leadership. I'm not saying they're bad, but because of certain things, servant leadership cannot take a front seat decision making. We have like nuclear facilities, safety and quality type of things, legal considerations. And so servant leadership is one of many styles that we can apply when we can. But
Yeah.
yellow tape and red tape are going to win over taking care of people every single time. And it has to be that way.
Well, if your 6-year-old child is about to run in the street in front of a car, it doesn't help to have a relationship. It helps to be directive
Yeah,
to get him out of
exactly.
that. So I think that's what you're saying. What's been your experience in the servant leadership realm?
So I was always a theory Y guy, and I said servant leadership is great. And I got beat up because my teams lacked discipline, and I was missing deadlines, and I was protecting my team, and my team was taking advantage of me.
Hmm.
And so I had to learn Theory X. I had to learn that, discipline comes first. You create that hard inner titanium structure first. And then within that structure, you can apply that servant leadership. And that's the proper way to build a house. You don't build a house around rugs and blankets. You build that hard infrastructure that people can trust first, and then you can have it nice and cozy inside. I think that probably paints the best image you can of any project.
Oh, that's good. I like that.
Yeah, that works.
And
Um,
did you stop missing deadlines after that?
you know, it's strange. Well, let's take my classrooms. In each class is a project. And for 12 years, I haven't missed a deadline. How's that?
Yeah, no, that's great.
because I establish that framework of discipline up front, and then I allow for the humanity to guide and to help people very easily attain what they need.
Well, and that makes a lot of sense. And I'm thinking, for my consulting career, and a project could be anywhere from 2 years to 4 years. I actually had one that went 6 years. But that first few months when you've got a whole new team and a whole new client and all different people, you're right. You have to establish some level of authoritative capability that says, I want to follow this person because they know what they're doing. As you start to trend towards that, and I don't want to say laissez-faire style, but more towards that servant leadership where you're pushing and upholding the people who are doing the work. I think you're right. I think there is that transitional phase before you can really be effective as a servant leader.
That's right. That's right. It's not showing your chops per se, and it's not demonstrating that you are the decision maker, but it's actually creating that environment of discipline so that
Yes.
people can internalize that. And people need that sense of discipline.
Yeah.
You know what? That was the role of middle management in the 90s and early 2000s. And when they got rid of middle manager, it was like getting rid of mom. And entire corporations got rid of that layer of mom, and all of a sudden the corporations were saying, why doesn't everybody have their shoes polished? Why doesn't everybody have their shirts tucked in? Well, you got rid of that discipline. And discipline does not mean harsh punishment or coercion. It means, it's creating a predictable environment where people can, feel safe.
And that is so important, especially, and I'll tell you, and we don't have a lot of time left, but I'll tell you from having one of the things that we always insisted on when we did our IT projects was that we had a full-time group of end users on the project to help with requirements, to help with testing, to help those sorts of things. The biggest problem we always had was the fact that they felt insecure because these bright IT people were clearly intelligent and way above them, and they were so sophisticated. Here, what I was just working a desk, and now you're asking me to be kind of shoulder to shoulder with these people. And part of what we had to do was to say, no, you are as important as that development manager, because it's through you that we're going to get our requirements established and our
Yep.
system done. So
You guys are experts where we are not, and we
that's right.
need your help or we're going to fail. Oh
Well,
boy.
I think, Tim, I think this has been a great discussion. We should probably think about extending this on another podcast coming up. But in the minute or so that we have left, Tim, where can we find you if we're looking for advice or consulting?
I'm out on LinkedIn. You can find me out there. You can also find me out on simplylearn.com. If you look at the PMP prep program, I'm the program advisor over there. Yeah,
Right.
those are the biggies. Otherwise, here in the local community, I'm all over and available through the chapter. And you can find me on the chapter website as well.
Great. And I'm also on LinkedIn, both as by my name, Merv Jersak, and also by my company name, which is People First Project Management. And I also have a website, People First Project Management. And if you go there, you will find, I believe, because I wrote them, so I believe you'll find about 150 or so blog articles that are very much related to many of the people aspects of what we do as project managers. And as we've learned today, as project leaders.
We really need to review those. I've read some of them, and they're full of knowledge and wisdom. And so as we go through our material, let's consider going back to those, because, like I said, you put a lot of thought in these topics, and it would be interesting to see as we progress through our talking together if your ideas have matured, or whether the original thoughts you have are still solid. And I bet they're still solid.
I think they always, as long as I'm consulting, they will always be tweaked, but they are based on some hard lessons learned and some war stories that I wish I didn't have to reveal in writing. But
I'm
let's do
with you.
this. Until next time, I bid you adieu, Tim.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always a pleasure, Merv. And for those of you watching this live or in recording, enjoy your day and reach out as you need. If it's only for a cup of coffee and a good conversation, that's great too. Have a great
Absolutely.
day, everyone.
We'll see you.